I had lived on that strip of land for 7 quiet years before the homeowner association ever learned my name. 7 years of predictable mornings where sunlight cut clean lines across my driveway. 7 years of working with my hands and keeping my head down. 7 years of knowing exactly where my property began and ended because I had walked every inch of it myself, measured it, maintained it, respected it, and built my life around it. And on the morning everything changed, I was doing nothing more rebellious than unloading lumber from the back of my truck. The air crisp, the sky cloudless, the sound of distant lawn equipment humming across the neighborhood. When a white pickup rolled to a stop at the edge of my gravel drive and a man stepped out holding a clipboard like it was a weapon, announcing himself as an enforcement officer for the homeowner association and informing me with rehearsed confidence that I was trespassing on association land. That my presence, my truck, and my materials were in violation, and that fines would begin accruing immediately unless I vacated the area. A statement so absurd it took me a moment to process because I wasn't on a common path or a buffer zone or a shared greenway. I was standing in the same spot my boots had worn smooth over years of routine, the same ground I paid taxes on, the same land my mailbox sat on, the same land I'd cleared brush from with my own hands when I first bought the place. And yet here was a man I'd never met speaking with absolute certainty about where I was allowed to stand. I asked him calmly who authorized this determination, and he tapped his clipboard. Said the association survey showed this entire access lane belonged to them, that I had no recorded right to use it, and that continued resistance would be documented as willful noncompliance. The words dripping with the kind of authority that only exists when someone assumes no one will challenge it. And as he spoke, neighbors began slowing as they passed, pretending not to watch while watching anyway, curious eyes catching the tension, the implication that I was some kind of offender caught in the act. And I could feel the pressure building, that subtle social squeeze where silence becomes agreement. So I told him he was mistaken, that my deed clearly included the lane, that I'd lived here longer than the current association board, that I had paperwork. And he smiled in a way that said paperwork didn't matter because his paperwork was newer, shinier, and backed by a board that liked to flex. He warned me that ignoring his notice would result in formal action, that vehicles could be towed, access blocked, and legal remedies pursued. Then handed me a printed violation slip already filled out, already dated, already assuming guilt, and drove off without waiting for a response, leaving me standing there with sawdust on my hands and a document accusing me of trespassing on my own property. And the thing that stuck with me wasn't the threat. It was the confidence, the certainty that I would either fold or fight blind, that I wouldn't know where to look, that I wouldn't have what I needed to push back. Because as I stood there reading the notice again, I realized this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was an opening move, deliberate and calculated, aimed at establishing control over a narrow strip of land that just happened to be the only access to my garage and workshop. Land that, if taken, would choke my ability to use half my property. Land that suddenly mattered very much to people who had ignored it for decades. And as the morning wore on and I tried to get back to work, I found myself replaying the exchange, the language he used, the way he avoided specifics, the way he leaned on the authority of a survey without naming who conducted it or when. And that set off a quiet alarm because I remembered something from the day I bought the house. A thick packet of documents handed over by a tired closing attorney who said most of it was routine, but some of it went back a long way. And I remembered a yellowed page, folded once, with a hand-drawn boundary sketch and a reference to a county filing number from the late 70s. Something I'd tucked away and forgotten because it had never mattered until now. And by midday, when another association vehicle cruised slowly past my drive, clearly checking whether I was still there, I knew this wasn't going to be resolved with a polite phone call. This was going to escalate because people who accuse you of trespassing don't stop at accusations. They move to enforcement, and enforcement meant signs, barriers, letters, fines, maybe even physical obstruction. And I wasn't about to let someone redraw my life with a clipboard, so I shut down my work early, went inside, and started pulling boxes from the closet where I kept everything I never thought I'd need again: deeds, plats, old correspondence, tax maps, anything that might tell the story of the land before the association existed, before rules and boards and enforcement officers. Back when property lines were decided by surveyors with transit levels and steel stakes instead of committees with agendas. And as the sun moved across the room and dust filled the air, I found the folder, thicker than I remembered, labeled simply with the property address and a year written in pen, 1978. And inside was more than I expected, not just the deed but a recorded survey, stamped and signed, filed with the county decades before the homeowner association was even a concept, showing the access lane clearly marked as a private right-of-way, granted, recorded, and never relinquished. A document that didn't argue or threaten or posture. It simply existed quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment someone tried to pretend it didn't. And as I sat there holding it, I realized the association hadn't just accused me of trespassing, they had challenged a fact they didn't know existed. And people who build authority on ignorance tend to double down when confronted. Which meant this was only the beginning, because somewhere in an office with framed rules and neatly stacked binders, someone had decided my land was expendable, my access negotiable, my compliance assumed. And they had no idea that a survey filed nearly half a century earlier was about to walk back into the daylight and undo everything they thought they controlled. The accusation didn't sit quietly after that day. It spread. And within 48 hours, the Homeowner Association turned a single clipboard encounter into a campaign, starting with a certified letter slid into my mailbox declaring I was unlawfully occupying association property and demanding immediate cessation of use, followed by a second letter warning of daily fines, then a third outlining the association's intent to install temporary barriers to prevent further encroachment. Language carefully chosen to sound procedural while threatening real disruption, and every piece of it relied on the same unnamed survey they refused to provide, the same vague authority they expected me to accept without question. And when I called the number listed on the notice, I was routed through layers of administrative voices until I was told flatly that the matter was closed, that the association had already determined the boundary, and that my disagreement would be noted but not reconsidered. Which told me everything I needed to know because determinations that fear scrutiny rarely survive it. And sure enough, the next escalation arrived physically when orange stakes appeared overnight along the edge of my access lane, bright plastic flags snapping in the breeze, positioned just close enough to make parking awkward and movement feel watched. A visual assertion of dominance meant to unsettle rather than clarify. And by midday, a laminated sign was zip-tied to one of them reading, HOA property. No trespassing, placed squarely where my tires passed every morning, an act that wasn't about enforcement so much as intimidation, about signaling to neighbors that I was the problem, the outlier, the rule breaker, and I could feel the atmosphere shift as people who used to wave now glanced away. Uncertainty spreading because authority had spoken even if truth hadn't, and I understood then that this wasn't just a boundary dispute. It was a pressure test to see if I'd fold under social and logistical strain. So instead of reacting publicly, I documented everything, photographing the stakes, the sign, the placement, the dates, the angles, the way the markers contradicted not just my survey but basic logic, because no access lane serving a single parcel suddenly becomes communal without a recorded transfer. And while the association seemed eager to act fast, they underestimated patience. Because patience is dangerous when paired with records. And while they sent notices, I made copies. While they placed signs, I logged times. And while they talked internally, I quietly requested copies of county plats, historical right-of-way filings, and archived subdivision documents. The kind of paperwork that lives in basements and microfilm drawers and never gets digitized because it's inconvenient. And when the association escalated again by dispatching a different enforcement officer to photograph my truck parked on the lane, citing it as evidence of continued violation, I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked for the survey they were relying on, and when he said it was proprietary and not subject to release, I smiled because surveys filed with counties are public by definition, and calling them proprietary only confirms someone doesn't want comparisons made. And that night another letter arrived, this one heavier, more formal, stating the board had voted to impose fines retroactively to the date of first notice, a move so aggressive it bordered on reckless, because retroactive enforcement only works when your foundation is unassailable, and theirs wasn't, but they didn't know that yet. All they knew was that I hadn't moved, hadn't complied, and hadn't made noise, which they mistook for weakness. And that miscalculation showed itself when temporary barriers went up 2 mornings later, lightweight but obstructive, narrowing the lane just enough to complicate access, installed during daylight by contracted workers who avoided eye contact and left quickly. And when I approached them, they told me they were just following work orders, which I believed because systems like this rely on people executing instructions without context, and I let them finish, photographed everything. And then removed nothing, because premature removal would shift the narrative from dispute to defiance. And I wanted the association to be the only party actively altering the landscape. And by the end of the week, the pressure was constant, notices taped, emails sent, neighbors whispering, a slow grind designed to exhaust me into compliance. But every escalation only made the contrast sharper between their assumed authority and the quiet certainty of the documents sitting in my folder. Especially the survey from 1978, the one that showed the lane not as a favor or exception but as a recorded right-of-way tied to the parcel itself, immune to later rulemaking. And when I finally responded, it wasn't with a rant or a threat but with a single formal letter sent certified to the association board, acknowledging receipt of their notices, disputing their claim in full, and requesting the immediate disclosure of the survey and legal basis for their actions. Attaching copies of my deed and referencing the recorded survey by filing number without yet including it. Because strategy isn't about revealing everything at once. It's about controlling tempo, and that letter landed like a stone in still water. Because the next response was slower, less confident, buying time, promising review, which told me internal conversations were happening, questions being asked that hadn't been asked before, and in that pause I knew the escalation phase was nearing its peak. Because organizations that move fast at first and then slow down are recalibrating, deciding whether to push harder or retreat quietly, and given the signs and barriers still standing, The fines still accruing on paper and the continued insistence that I was trespassing, I knew which direction they were leaning, and that meant the next move wouldn't be letters or signs, it would be formal action, hearings, enforcement proceedings, maybe even law enforcement involvement. A public stage where they expected compliance to finally be forced. And the irony was that every step they took, assuming I had no ground to stand on, was building a record of overreach that would make what came next impossible to ignore. Because when someone accuses you of trespassing long enough, eventually they demand proof you belong, and that demand was exactly what I'd been waiting for. The breaking point arrived the moment the Homeowner Association stopped pretending this was a paperwork dispute and decided to make it a public spectacle. Because one clear morning, a formal notice was taped to my front door announcing an emergency compliance hearing scheduled for the following week, citing repeated trespass, failure to obey posted restrictions, and obstruction of association property, language heavy enough to imply criminality without quite saying it. And when I read it, I understood this wasn't about the lane anymore, it was about authority saving face, about proving they could force submission once momentum was lost. And the hearing notice was paired with a second document informing me that if I continued to use the access lane prior to the hearing, the association would authorize immediate towing and seek an injunction. A threat that carried weight because it didn't require them to be right, only aggressive. And that was the moment the situation shifted from inconvenient to dangerous, because towing a work vehicle or blocking access would cripple my ability to function day to day. And they knew it, which is why the next escalation came before the hearing even took place, when two association representatives arrived with a uniformed officer to observe conditions carefully framed as a civil standby, but staged in full view of the neighborhood. A calculated display meant to imply law enforcement agreement even though no determination had been made. And as they walked the lane pointing at markers and reading from a printed summary of violations, the officer said nothing, just listened, which the association took as endorsement. And when I calmly stated that the land was mine and the right-of-way was recorded, one of the representatives cut me off and said the board had already ruled on that, as if repetition could replace evidence. And I realized then that the hearing wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to ratify a decision already made. And that meant if I walked into that room unprepared, they would bury me under procedure, outvote me, and proceed as if dissent had been resolved, because that's how internal governance works when no external force intervenes, and the stress of it sat heavy over the following days as the barriers tightened. The signs multiplied and neighbors grew increasingly distant. Some quietly sympathetic but unwilling to get involved, others openly parroting the association's language about rules and order. And I could feel the squeeze closing, the sense that I was being isolated and framed as unreasonable simply for refusing to surrender ground I legally owned. And the night before the hearing, I stood in my garage looking at the access lane narrowed by cones and tape, knowing that by the next afternoon they would either back down or attempt to take something from me that could not be easily returned. And that knowledge sharpened everything, because crises clarify priorities, and mine was simple. I wasn't going to argue opinions in a room full of people who didn't want to hear them. I was going to present facts that couldn't be voted away. And that meant the survey, the 1978 filing that predated the subdivision, the board, the rules, and every assumption they were leaning on. But even then, I knew the danger wasn't just losing the hearing, it was that if the association pushed far enough without checking themselves, they would cross into territory where their actions were no longer administrative but unlawful. And organizations rarely realize that line has been crossed until someone outside their bubble points to it. And by morning, the pressure was tangible, the lane blocked enough to require careful maneuvering. Another notice slipped under my door, warning of final consequences, and the sense that they were rushing towards something irreversible. And when I arrived at the hearing room that afternoon, a bright municipal space filled with folding chairs and long tables, the board members sat arranged in a neat row, documents stacked, expressions fixed, confident in the process they controlled. And as I took my seat, I could see the outcome they expected written plainly in their posture. Because they thought they were about to formalize my defeat, not realizing they were standing at the edge of their own undoing. And when the chair opened the meeting by restating the trespass allegations and referencing the association's survey as settled fact, I felt the weight of the moment settle in, because this was the point where either authority would collapse under scrutiny or it would crush me under procedure. And there would be no middle ground, because the worst crises aren't loud. They're quiet rooms where decisions are made under the assumption that no one will challenge the foundation. And I was sitting there knowing the foundation was wrong, knowing the next few minutes would determine whether I walked out vindicated or watched my access stripped away by people who had never bothered to check what existed before them. The turning point didn't come from anything said in that room. It came from what I placed on the table once the board finished reciting their conclusions. Because after listening to them describe my land as association property, after hearing the chair declare that their survey superseded all prior understandings, I stood up without raising my voice and slid a single document forward. Thick, aged, unmistakable, the kind of paper that doesn't argue but endures. And for the first time since this began, I watched confidence falter. because stamped across the top was the county seal and the year 1978, and beneath it a professionally drafted survey showing the access lane labeled clearly as a recorded private right-of-way appurtenant to my parcel, filed, indexed, and never vacated. And as the room leaned forward, I explained calmly that this document predated the subdivision, the association, and every rule they had cited. That it was referenced in my deed, and that under state law no subsequent association action could extinguish it without formal abandonment proceedings, none of which had ever occurred, and the silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was calculation, the sound of people realizing they had moved too fast. And when one board member asked where I obtained it, I replied that it had been on file with the county for 45 years, accessible to anyone who bothered to look. Which shifted the atmosphere instantly because authority hates nothing more than being exposed as careless. And the association's attorney, who had been leaning back comfortably until that moment, sat forward and asked to examine the document, flipping pages, checking the filing number, the signatures, the reference points, and I could see the exact second he recognized it for what it was, not just valid but devastating, because surveys like that don't expire and they don't bend to policy. They establish facts on the ground that governance must respect, and suddenly the board's confident narrative unraveled, questions emerged about why this had never been reviewed, why enforcement had proceeded without verification, why barriers were installed on land not owned by the association. And as the discussion turned inward, the chair attempted to regain control, suggesting a recess. But the damage was done because once a document like that enters the record, it changes the nature of everything, turning a compliance hearing into an exposure, and that exposure deepened when the attorney acknowledged on the record that the association's survey, the one they'd relied on so heavily, did not reference the 1978 filing at all, a glaring omission that suggested either negligence or intentional avoidance, neither of which plays well when enforcement actions have already been taken. And at that moment the hearing ceased to be about me entirely and became about the association's liability. Because blocking a recorded right-of-way isn't a policy dispute, it's an unlawful interference with property rights. And I could see it dawning on them in real time as they realized every sign, every barrier, every fine notice was now evidence against them. And when the chair finally called the recess, it was less an act of control and more an attempt to stop the bleeding. But the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Because during that break, the attorney pulled me aside and asked quietly whether I intended to pursue damages, a question that answered itself, because you don't ask it unless you know you're exposed, and I told him my priority was restoring access and stopping enforcement, nothing more, which wasn't a concession so much as a signal that escalation had limits if corrected quickly. And when the hearing reconvened, the tone was entirely different, cautious, restrained. With the board acknowledging that new information had come to light and that enforcement actions would be suspended pending review, language chosen carefully to avoid admitting fault while implicitly retreating. And as they spoke, I realized something important. This wasn't just a win in a room, it was the unraveling of a strategy built on the assumption that no one would challenge them with something older and stronger than their rules. And the moment they realized that assumption was wrong, their authority cracked. Because authority without legitimacy collapses under its own weight. And by the time the meeting adjourned with no fines imposed and a promise of immediate barrier removal, the crisis had passed its peak, leaving behind not triumph but clarity, the clarity that comes when a quiet document outlasts loud accusations. And as I walked out into the daylight with the folder under my arm, I knew the association's next move wouldn't be confrontation, it would be damage control. Because once a survey from 1978 re-enters the conversation, pretending it doesn't exist is no longer an option. The fallout moved faster than I expected once the association realized retreat was their only option. Because within 24 hours the barriers were gone, the signs vanished, and the orange stakes were pulled as if they had never existed, a quiet overnight cleanup that spoke louder than any apology. And by the end of the week a formal notice arrived confirming all fines were voided, all enforcement actions rescinded, and the access lane formally acknowledged as a recorded private right-of-way. Language carefully drafted to sound administrative while conceding everything that mattered. And what struck me most was how quickly certainty evaporated once it was challenged with something real. Because the same board that had accused me of trespassing with absolute confidence now spoke in cautious, neutral tones, avoiding eye contact, avoiding responsibility, avoiding any reference to how aggressively they had acted, and that avoidance became its own consequence, because neighbors noticed. They noticed the sudden silence, the removal of signs, the way the association stopped talking about rules and surveys altogether. And in that vacuum the truth spread not through announcements but through observation. Through the simple fact that I kept using the lane and nothing happened, no towing, no tickets, no enforcement, just normal life resuming where conflict had been. And normalcy is devastating to false authority because it exposes how unnecessary the disruption was in the first place. And as days turned into weeks, the association's internal response surfaced in small ways. A special board meeting announced and then canceled, a revised enforcement policy circulated emphasizing verification prior to action, a new requirement that historical filings be reviewed before boundary determinations, changes that looked procedural but were clearly corrective. And the most telling moment came when a revised community map was quietly uploaded to the association website. Updated to reflect the 1978 survey, my access lane clearly marked as private. No announcement, no explanation, just a silent correction that rewrote their narrative without admitting it had ever been wrong. And I let it stand because victories don't need speeches when they're built on records. And the final confirmation arrived when the association's attorney sent a brief letter acknowledging that the board had acted without full information and confirming that no further action would be taken. A sentence that carried weight because it closed the door permanently. And with that closure came a shift in how people interacted with me, neighbors who had avoided eye contact now stopping to talk, admitting they'd wondered how the association could claim land that had clearly been used privately for decades. Others asking quietly how I found the survey, surprised to learn it had always been there, filed, stamped, ignored, and that surprise was the real lesson in all of this. Because power often relies less on malice than on neglect, on the assumption that what's old doesn't matter, that what predates current systems can be overwritten by confidence and repetition. And when that assumption fails, the collapse is quick and total, and the association learned that the hard way, not because I shouted or threatened or escalated recklessly, but because I waited until they demanded proof and then gave them something they couldn't outvote. And standing in my driveway weeks later watching sunlight fall across the same access lane that had sparked the entire conflict, I felt something quieter than satisfaction, a sense of correction, of things snapping back into alignment after being forced out of place. Because the land hadn't changed, the facts hadn't changed, only the story being told about them had, and once the true story resurfaced, everything else fell away, and that's what stayed with me most. Not the stress or the confrontation or the hearing room tension, but how fragile authority becomes when it forgets to check the ground it stands on, how quickly certainty dissolves when challenged by something patient and precise, and how important it is to know what you own where it begins, and what was recorded long before anyone thought to question it, because accusations come and go, boards change, rules evolve, but surveys filed in 1978 don't care about momentum or opinion. They sit quietly until needed, and when they're finally brought back into the light, they don't just defend your ground, they remind everyone else where theirs actually ends.